April 30th, 1945. Berlin was burning. Soviet artillery shells screamed through the smoke-filled sky as the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash. In the chaos of Germany's final hours, thousands of Nazi officials vanished without a trace. Most were captured or killed in the aftermath. Others fled to South America or disappeared into the mountains. But one man, Oberst Heinrich Müller, simply walked out of his command bunker and evaporated from history. For 79 years, his disappearance remained one of World War II's most puzzling mysteries. That is, until a construction crew in Bavaria stumbled upon something that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the war's end. The discovery wasn't just shocking, it was impossible. Hidden beneath decades of overgrowth and carefully concealed from the world, they found Müller's secret safehouse. But what was inside defied all logic. Documents that should have been destroyed, artifacts that proved the war didn't end the way history books told us, and evidence of a plan so audacious that it could have changed the course of the 20th century. What Heinrich Müller was hiding in that underground fortress wasn't just his own survival. It was a secret that powerful people had spent nearly 8 decades ensuring would never see daylight. Heinrich Müller wasn't your typical Nazi officer. While most of his colleagues were focused on political ideology or military glory, Müller was obsessed with something far more dangerous: intelligence. As head of the Gestapo's Foreign Intelligence Division, he had access to secrets that even Hitler's inner circle didn't know about. He knew which Allied spies had been turned, which resistance networks had been compromised, and most importantly, he knew exactly how much time Germany had left. By early 1945, while Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels was still promising miracle weapons and final victory, Müller was quietly preparing for the inevitable collapse. Unlike other high-ranking officials who hoped to negotiate their way out of war crimes tribunals, Müller had a different plan entirely. He wasn't just planning to escape. He was planning to disappear so completely that the world would forget he ever existed. The last confirmed sighting of Heinrich Müller was on April 29, 1945, in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin. Witnesses reported seeing him in heated discussion with SS leader Heinrich Himmler about something they called Project Nightfall. No records of this project survived the war, and both men would be dead or missing within days. But according to recently declassified Soviet intelligence files, Müller left the bunker carrying a leather briefcase that he never let out of his sight. What was in that briefcase? The Soviets spent months trying to find out. They interrogated every surviving bunker occupant, tortured captured SS officers, and even offered massive rewards for information about Müller's whereabouts. But Heinrich Müller had vanished as if he never existed. His body was never found. His family claimed they had no contact with him after the war. Even the most dedicated Nazi hunters eventually gave up the search. For decades, historians assumed Müller had either died in the battle for Berlin or successfully fled to South America like so many other war criminals. Some theories placed him in Argentina, others in Paraguay or Brazil. A few wild claims suggested he had been secretly recruited by American or Soviet intelligence agencies. But there was never any proof. Heinrich Müller had become a ghost. The truth was far stranger than anyone imagined. While Berlin burned above ground, Müller was already 200 miles away in the Bavarian Alps, putting the finishing touches on a hideout that would keep him hidden for the rest of his life. But this wasn't just any hideout. This was a technological marvel that wouldn't look out of place in a modern spy thriller. September 15, 2024. The construction crew from Albrecht Building Services was supposed to be laying foundation for a new luxury hotel in the picturesque village of Berchtesgaden. The location was perfect. Rolling hills, pristine lakes, and enough distance from major cities to attract wealthy tourists looking for authentic Bavarian experiences. What they found instead would shut down the entire construction project and bring federal investigators rushing to the scene. Klaus Weber, the site foreman, noticed something odd about the ground resistance readings. His equipment was picking up hollow spaces beneath what should have been solid rock. At first, he assumed they had encountered natural cave systems common to the region. The Alps were riddled with limestone caverns that could cause foundation problems if not properly addressed. But when his crew broke through the surface layer, they didn't find caves. They found concrete, lots of it, reinforced concrete walls that were clearly man-made and designed to last centuries. The construction was so sophisticated that it looked almost modern, certainly not like anything that should have existed in rural Bavaria during the 1940 seconds. Weber immediately called his supervisor, who contacted local authorities, who in turn alerted federal investigators specializing in wartime artifacts. Within 48 hours, the site was swarming with archaeologists, historians, and government officials. What they uncovered defied belief. The concrete walls were just the beginning. Beneath the surface lay an elaborate underground complex that stretched over 2,000 square feet. Multiple rooms connected by reinforced corridors, complete with ventilation systems, power generation equipment, and storage facilities that could have sustained several people for years. But it was the personal artifacts that made investigators realize they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. In what appeared to be a private office, they found a desk drawer containing identification papers bearing Heinrich Müller's photograph. Not forged documents or false identities. Original Gestapo credentials that matched perfectly with records from Nazi archives. The papers were in pristine condition, as if they had been placed there yesterday. Dr. Elisabeth Hoffmann, a specialist in Third Reich history from the University of Munich, was among the first experts allowed into the complex. What she discovered would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the war's end. The Safehouse wasn't just a hiding place. It was a fully operational intelligence center equipped with radio equipment, document analysis tools, and most shocking of all, detailed files on hundreds of Allied personnel that extended well into the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. These weren't wartime intelligence reports. These were post-war surveillance files suggesting that Heinrich Müller had continued his intelligence operations for decades after Germany's surrender. Files contained photographs of American diplomats, British intelligence officers, and Soviet officials taken years after the war ended. Someone had been watching, documenting, and analyzing Allied activities long after the Third Reich officially ceased to exist. The implications were staggering. If Müller had indeed survived and operated from this hidden complex, it meant that Nazi intelligence operations had continued far longer than anyone realized. But that raised an even more disturbing question. Who was he working for? And why had he spent decades collecting information on the very people who had defeated Germany? Room by room, investigators began piecing together the scope of Müller's post-war activities. The complex contained a sophisticated workshop where documents could be forged, photographs developed, and coded messages prepared. A medical facility suggested someone had planned for long-term habitation, complete with surgical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies that would have been nearly impossible to obtain in post-war Germany. Most intriguing was a locked vault built into the deepest part of the complex. The lock mechanism was unlike anything investigators had seen before. Not a simple combination lock or key system, but an intricate mechanical puzzle that required knowledge of specific sequences and timing. It took specialists 3 weeks to crack the mechanism without damaging whatever might be inside. What they found would rewrite the final chapter of World War II. The vault contained thousands of documents, photographs, and recordings that painted a picture of post-war Europe that no history book had ever described. Evidence of secret negotiations between former Nazi officials and Allied intelligence agencies. Proof of operation networks that had continued functioning years after the official end of hostilities, and most shocking of all, detailed plans for something called Operation Phoenix, The documents were meticulously organized and cross-referenced, suggesting that whoever had compiled them possessed an almost obsessive attention to detail. Each file was dated, categorized, and annotated with handwritten notes in what forensic experts confirmed was Heinrich Müller's distinctive handwriting. But the dates on these documents extended far beyond 1945. The most recent entries were dated 1967, more than 20 years after Müller's supposed disappearance. Operation Phoenix, according to the recovered documents, was not a Nazi plan. It was something far more complex and far more dangerous. A joint operation involving former German intelligence officers, American CIA operatives, and Soviet KGB agents working together toward a common goal that transcended the ideological boundaries of the Cold War. The document suggested that while the world believed these intelligence agencies were locked in eternal conflict, their leadership had been secretly collaborating on projects that served interests beyond national loyalty. But collaboration toward what end? The Phoenix Files hinted at something called the European Continuity Project, a long-term plan to ensure that certain power structures would survive regardless of which political systems rose or fell. The plan involved creating hidden networks of influence that could operate independently of any government, maintaining stability through controlled intelligence operations that would guide European development for decades. According to Müller's notes, he hadn't been hiding from Allied justice. He had been working for it, or more precisely, working for elements within Allied intelligence agencies that saw value in preserving certain aspects of German organizational efficiency while eliminating the ideological components they found objectionable. The war might have ended, but the intelligence war was just beginning, and Heinrich Müller had positioned himself as a crucial asset in that new conflict. The more investigators studied the Phoenix documents, the more questions arose. If Müller had been working with Allied intelligence agencies, why had his survival been kept secret for so long? Why had he been officially listed as missing rather than recruited? And most importantly, how many other former Nazi officials had been quietly integrated into post-war intelligence operations without public knowledge? Knowledge? The answers lay deeper in the vault, in a section that investigators almost missed entirely. Hidden behind a false wall was a smaller chamber containing what appeared to be Müller's personal archive. Unlike the official documents and intelligence reports, these files told a more intimate story of a man who had watched the world transform around him while remaining frozen in time. Personal diary entries revealed the psychological toll of his decades-long isolation. Müller wrote extensively about the burden of maintaining multiple identities, the constant fear of discovery, and the gradual realization that the world he had helped create was disappearing piece by piece. But these weren't the rambling thoughts of a defeated man. They were the calculated observations of someone who understood that his survival depended on adapting to circumstances beyond his control. One entry, dated March 1953, was particularly revealing. Müller described a meeting with someone identified only as the American who had proposed a new arrangement. The details were cryptic, but the implications were clear. Müller's expertise in Soviet intelligence networks had become valuable to Western agencies struggling to understand their former allies turned adversaries. The Cold War had created opportunities for men like Müller to reinvent themselves as assets rather than criminals. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a temperature-controlled section of the vault, investigators found film reels and photographic negatives that had been preserved with scientific precision. When developed and digitized, these images revealed surveillance operations that had been conducted across Europe throughout the 1,950 seconds and early 1,960 seconds. Not random intelligence gathering, but targeted monitoring of specific individuals who would later become prominent political leaders, business executives, and academic figures. The scope was breathtaking. Mueller's network had been documenting the personal lives, financial dealings, and private conversations of people who would shape post-war Europe. Future prime ministers, corporate chairmen, and university presidents had all been under surveillance during their early careers, often without ever knowing they were being watched. The question that haunted investigators was whether this information had been used to influence their later decisions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in Cold War intelligence operations from Cambridge University, was brought in to analyze the surveillance materials. Her preliminary findings suggested something far more sophisticated than simple espionage. The targets had been selected based on psychological profiles that predicted their future influence potential. Someone had been identifying tomorrow's leaders while they were still unknown quantities and positioning themselves to monitor or manipulate their rise to power. The technical sophistication of the surveillance equipment found in the complex was decades ahead of what should have been available in the immediate post-war period. Miniature cameras, electronic listening devices, and communication systems that wouldn't become standard intelligence tools until the 1,960 seconds were all present and clearly had been used extensively. Either Mueller had access to experimental technology that historians knew nothing about, or he had been receiving support from organizations with resources far beyond what any individual could possess. Radio equipment found in the complex provided additional clues about Mueller's post-war activities. Frequency logs showed regular communication with stations across Europe, South America, and North Africa, extending well into the 1,960 seconds. The communications were encrypted using systems that intelligence experts recognized but couldn't immediately decode. Breaking these codes would require resources that only government agencies possessed, suggesting that Mueller's activities were of interest to modern intelligence services as well as historians. While technical experts worked to decode the communications, investigators made another startling discovery in what appeared to be Mueller's living quarters. Personal effects suggested that the complex had been inhabited almost continuously from 1,945 until at least the late 1,960 seconds. Not just by Mueller, but by multiple individuals whose identities remained unknown. Clothing in different sizes, personal hygiene items, and medical records indicated that the Safehouse had served as a refuge for several people over the decades. Among these personal effects were items that challenged the timeline of Mueller's disappearance entirely. Clothing labels and manufacturing dates suggested that someone had been making regular trips to acquire supplies well into the 1,960 seconds. Either Mueller had maintained contact with the outside world throughout his supposed disappearance, or others had been supporting his hidden existence for reasons that remained unclear. The medical records were particularly intriguing. Detailed health monitoring data suggested that whoever had been living in the complex had received professional medical care on a regular basis. Not emergency treatment, but routine health care that would have required ongoing contact with qualified physicians. The medications listed in the medical files included treatments for conditions that wouldn't become available until the 1,950 seconds and early 1,960 seconds, again suggesting that Mueller's isolation hadn't been as complete as it appeared. Financial records discovered in a sealed container revealed how Mueller had funded his decades-long operation. Swiss bank account numbers, investment portfolios, and property holdings across multiple countries painted a picture of carefully managed wealth that had grown substantially over time. The initial funding appeared to have come from assets that had been secretly moved out of Germany before the war's end, but the investment strategies showed sophisticated understanding of post-war economic development. More disturbing were records suggesting that Mueller had maintained financial relationships with corporations and institutions that had publicly denounced their wartime associations with Nazi Germany. Companies that had claimed to have severed all ties with former regime officials were apparently continuing to provide financial services to someone they knew was Heinrich Mueller. The implications for corporate responsibility and post-war justice were staggering. But the financial records also revealed something unexpected: large payments to organizations that investigators recognized as legitimate charitable foundations, refugee assistance programs, and educational institutions. Either Mueller had developed an unexpected conscience during his years in hiding, or these payments served purposes that weren't immediately apparent. The amounts were substantial enough to suggest that charitable giving had been a significant component of his post-war activities. As investigators worked through months of documentation, a pattern began to emerge that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the transition from war to peace had actually occurred. Rather than a clean break between Nazi Germany and post-war Europe, the evidence suggested a complex web of continuity that had allowed certain individuals and networks to survive and adapt while maintaining their influence through different channels. The Phoenix documents hinted at similar operations in other countries, suggesting that Mueller's Bavarian complex was just one node in a larger network that had been established across Europe. If true, the implications were enormous. The post-war order that historians had studied and analyzed for decades might have been shaped by hidden influences that had never been acknowledged or investigated. Intelligence agencies across Europe began reviewing their own archives, looking for evidence of similar operations that might have been overlooked or deliberately concealed. What they found would either confirm or refute the story that Heinrich Müller's Safehouse was telling. But regardless of what those investigations revealed, the discovery in Bavaria had already accomplished something significant. It had forced the world to reconsider what they thought they knew about how history's darkest chapter had actually ended. The story was far from over. Each document analyzed raised new questions about the scope and duration of post-war Nazi influence. Each photograph decoded revealed surveillance operations that had implications for understanding how European political development had been shaped in ways that might never have been publicly acknowledged. Heinrich Müller's secret safehouse had preserved more than just one man's survival. It had preserved evidence of a shadow history that ran parallel to the official narrative of post-war recovery and reconstruction. The investigation took a darker turn when forensic experts began analyzing the underground complex's construction timeline. Carbon dating of concrete samples revealed something that made investigators question everything they thought they understood about Müller's disappearance. The complex hadn't been built during the war's final months, as initially assumed. Construction had begun in 1943, nearly 2 years before Germany's collapse, suggesting that Müller had been planning his vanishing act long before defeat became inevitable. This revelation forced investigators to reconsider the entire narrative. Müller hadn't been scrambling to escape in the war's final days. He had been methodically preparing for a post-war existence that he knew was coming. The level of planning required for such an undertaking suggested access to resources and information that went far beyond what even high-ranking Gestapo officers typically possessed. Someone with extraordinary foresight had been helping him prepare for a future that most Nazi officials couldn't even imagine. Construction records hidden within the complex revealed the identities of the workers who had built Müller's sanctuary. Most were skilled craftsmen who had been recruited through intermediaries, told they were building a government emergency facility. What made their testimony particularly chilling was that none of them had survived the war. According to death certificates that investigators tracked down, every single worker had died in various accidents, bombing raids, or military actions between 1944 and 1945. The systematic elimination of everyone who knew about the complex's existence pointed to a level of operational security that was almost unprecedented. Either Müller had possessed the authority to order the deaths of dozens of civilian workers, or he had been working with others who could arrange such eliminations without arousing suspicion. The implications suggested that his post-war survival plan had been supported by elements within the Nazi hierarchy who remained unidentified. Dr. Hoffman's team made another disturbing discovery, while analyzing the complex's communication systems. The radio equipment wasn't just sophisticated for its time. It was experimental technology that matched descriptions of prototype devices that Allied intelligence agencies had been desperately trying to locate after the war. These devices had been developed by German scientists who had supposedly been captured or killed during the final offensive. Yet, here they were, fully operational in Heinrich Müller's hidden bunker. The presence of this advanced technology raised questions about the fate of German scientists and engineers who had vanished during the war's end. Official records claimed that most had been captured and recruited for American or Soviet weapons programs. But the equipment in Müller's complex suggested that some had continued their work in complete secrecy, developing technologies that wouldn't appear in mainstream intelligence operations for another decade. Among the technical documentation, investigators found detailed schematics for surveillance devices that bore striking similarities to equipment that would later be used by intelligence agencies throughout the Cold War. The designs were signed with initials that matched known German scientists, but dated years after these individuals had supposedly been relocated to Allied research facilities. Either the official records were incomplete, or some of Germany's most valuable scientific assets had been secretly retained for operations that remained hidden from public view. The medical facility within the complex contained evidence of procedures that went far beyond basic health care. Surgical equipment suggested that complex operations had been performed, while pharmaceutical records indicated access to experimental drugs that wouldn't become available to civilian populations for years. Most disturbing were surgical notes, written in Müller's handwriting, describing procedures performed on unidentified subjects whose conditions weren't consistent with routine medical care. These medical records painted a picture of ongoing human experimentation that had continued long after the war's official end. The subjects were identified only by numbers, but their physical descriptions and medical histories suggested they were individuals who had been brought to the complex against their will. The procedures described included psychological conditioning techniques that bore similarities to methods later associated with intelligence agency interrogation programs. One particularly detailed medical file described a subject identified as Patient 47, whose treatment had extended over several years in the early 1,950 seconds. The procedures included memory suppression techniques, chemical conditioning, and psychological manipulation designed to alter personality and behavior patterns. The notes suggested that Patient 47 had been successfully conditioned to perform specific tasks while retaining no memory of their previous identity or experiences. The implications were staggering. If Müller had been conducting mind control experiments in his hidden complex, it meant that Nazi human experimentation had continued for years after the regime's supposed elimination. But more disturbing was the possibility that these techniques had been perfected and shared with Allied intelligence agencies that were struggling to develop similar capabilities during the early Cold War period. Financial records revealed payments to medical professionals and research institutions across Europe, suggesting that Müller's experimental programs had been supported by a network of collaborators who remained active in legitimate medical practice. Some of these institutions were prestigious hospitals and universities that had publicly condemned Nazi medical experiments while apparently continuing to benefit from research conducted in secret facilities like Müller's complex. The scope of this medical network became clear when investigators discovered correspondence between Müller and researchers at institutions in Switzerland, Sweden, and Argentina. The letters discussed ongoing projects using terminology that matched documented Nazi medical experiments, but the dates showed that these discussions had continued well into the 1,960 seconds. The international nature of this collaboration suggested that post-war medical research had been influenced by Nazi experimentation to a degree that had never been publicly acknowledged. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a collection of identity documents for individuals who had supposedly died during the war, but whose photographs appeared in Muller's files with dates from the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. These weren't simple cases of mistaken identity. The photographs showed the same individuals at different ages, suggesting that people who had been officially declared dead had been living under new identities while continuing their pre-war work. The identity documents revealed a systematic program for relocating Nazi officials and scientists who possessed valuable knowledge or skills. Rather than facing justice or fleeing to South America, many had been provided with new identities and integrated into post-war European society. The program appeared to have been coordinated by Muller's organization, which had maintained detailed records of each individual's new identity, location, and ongoing activities. This witness protection program for Nazi war criminals had operated with a level of sophistication that suggested official support from Allied intelligence agencies. The quality of the forged documents, the thoroughness of the background stories, and the integration into legitimate institutions all required resources that only government organizations could provide. The evidence suggested that Allied agencies had been secretly recruiting Nazi officials while publicly prosecuting others for identical crimes. The most shocking revelation came from a locked filing cabinet that contained what appeared to be Muller's personal insurance policy. Detailed records of every operation, every collaboration, and every secret agreement that had allowed him to survive and prosper after the war. These files weren't just historical records. They were leverage, designed to ensure that his powerful protectors would continue supporting him indefinitely. The insurance files revealed the names and activities of Allied intelligence officers who had been secretly collaborating with former Nazi officials throughout the Cold War period. Operations that had been publicly attributed to legitimate intelligence work were revealed to have been planned and executed by networks that included war criminals who should have been in prison. The scope of this collaboration extended to the highest levels of post-war intelligence organizations. Among these files were photographs and documents that could have destroyed the careers of prominent political figures, intelligence officials, and business leaders across Europe and North America. Muller had been systematically collecting evidence of illegal activities, moral compromises, and secret agreements that his collaborators had hoped would remain hidden forever. His survival hadn't just depended on his usefulness. It had depended on his ability to threaten those who might consider eliminating him. The blackmail material extended far beyond intelligence operations. Muller had documented financial corruption, personal indiscretions, and criminal activities involving individuals who had shaped post-war European development. The files suggested that major political decisions, business mergers, and international agreements had been influenced by threats to reveal information that would have ended careers and toppled governments. This revelation cast doubt on fundamental assumptions about how post-war democracy had developed in Europe. If major decisions had been influenced by blackmail operations conducted by former Nazi officials, then the entire process of reconstruction and reconciliation might have been compromised from the beginning. The implications for understanding Cold War politics were enormous, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Muller's insurance files was their organization. They weren't random collections of compromising material. They were carefully categorized and cross-referenced, suggesting that the blackmail had been coordinated as part of a larger strategy. Someone had been using this information systematically to influence European development according to a plan that remained hidden even from the intelligence agencies that had been unwittingly serving it. The final section of Muller's archive contained documents that investigators initially dismissed as fantasy or psychological deterioration. References to something called the Eternal Reich, a concept that bore no resemblance to Nazi ideology, but instead described a form of governance that transcended national boundaries and political systems. The documents suggested that certain individuals had been working toward establishing permanent institutions that would survive regardless of which governments rose or fell. These Eternal Reich documents described a vision of European unity that predated and influenced the development of what would eventually become the European Union. But this wasn't the democratic integration that official histories described. This was a technocratic system designed to concentrate power in the hands of individuals who possessed specialized knowledge and skills, regardless of their political backgrounds or wartime activities. The documents revealed that former Nazi officials hadn't just been seeking survival after the war. They had been working toward a form of influence that would allow them to shape European development according to principles that combined German organizational efficiency with Allied democratic rhetoric. The goal wasn't to restore Nazi Germany, but to create something new that preserved what they considered the valuable aspects of both systems while eliminating the elements that had led to conflict. This vision of post-war Europe had apparently attracted support from individuals within Allied governments who were concerned about the challenges of managing complex modern societies. The documents suggested that certain officials had been willing to overlook wartime activities in exchange for expertise that could help address post-war reconstruction challenges. The collaboration hadn't been based on ideology, but on practical considerations that transcended political boundaries. As investigators worked through the implications of these discoveries, they began to understand that Heinrich Müller's Safehouse contained more than just evidence of one man's survival. It contained proof that the transition from war to peace had been far more complex and morally ambiguous than official histories had acknowledged. The clean narrative of Allied victory over evil had been complicated by evidence of ongoing collaboration that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice, accountability, and the nature of post-war reconstruction. The investigation was far from complete. Each document analyzed revealed new connections and raised additional questions about the scope of post-war Nazi influence. Intelligence agencies across Europe began conducting their own investigations, trying to determine how much of their institutional history had been shaped by collaborations they had never acknowledged. The discovery of Heinrich Müller's secret Safehouse had opened a door to understanding post-war Europe that many powerful people had hoped would remain permanently closed. But the evidence was undeniable. The war's end hadn't eliminated Nazi influence. It had transformed it into something more subtle and potentially more dangerous. A network of individuals who had learned to adapt their methods while preserving their goals, operating within the very institutions that had been created to prevent their return to power. The investigation took a chilling turn when Dr. Mitchell's team discovered something that had been overlooked in the initial sweep of the complex. Hidden behind a false panel in what appeared to be Müller's private study was a small room that served as a communication center unlike anything they had seen before. The equipment inside wasn't just advanced for the 1,940 seconds. Some of it appeared to incorporate technology that shouldn't have existed until the 1,970 seconds or later. The centerpiece was a transmission device that bore no resemblance to standard wartime radio equipment. Its design incorporated solid-state components that predated the commercial development of transistor technology by more than a decade. Either German scientists had achieved technological breakthroughs that had never been documented, or Müller had maintained access to experimental research that continued long after the war's official end. Operating manuals found near the equipment were written in a code that combined German technical terminology with symbols that didn't match any known encryption system. When cryptographers finally broke portions of the code, they discovered transmission logs showing regular contact with stations across 6 continents, extending into the late 1,960 seconds. The communications weren't random intelligence gathering. They followed specific patterns that suggested coordination of activities on a global scale. More disturbing were references to something called Protocol 7, mentioned repeatedly in the decoded transmissions, but never fully explained. The context suggested it was an emergency procedure that could be activated under specific circumstances, but the nature of those circumstances remained unclear. What was clear was that Protocol 7 involved assets positioned in government institutions, intelligence agencies, and major corporations across the Western world. Dr. Hoffman made another discovery that challenged everything investigators thought they understood about the timeline of Mueller's activities. In a climate-controlled storage area, they found newspapers and magazines from major European cities dating from 1945 through 1967. But these weren't random collections. Someone had been systematically clipping articles about specific political developments, business mergers, and social changes, then annotating them with handwritten notes that showed remarkable prescience about future events. The annotations revealed that whoever had been analyzing these developments possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict political outcomes, economic trends, and social changes years before they occurred. Either Mueller had been an extraordinary analyst, or he had access to information that allowed him to anticipate events that appeared random to contemporary observers. The implications suggested that major post-war developments might not have been as spontaneous as they appeared. Financial analysis of the complex's funding revealed something that made investigators question the scope of post-war collaboration between former enemies. The initial construction costs had been enormous, far beyond what any individual could have financed from personal resources. But the funding hadn't come from Nazi gold or stolen assets as initially suspected. It had come from legitimate financial institutions in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States, all of which had provided loans and investment services to someone they knew was Heinrich Müller. The financial trail led to a web of shell companies and holding corporations that had been established in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender. These entities had been created not to hide stolen Nazi assets, but to manage ongoing business relationships that continued operating as if the war had never happened. Major corporations that had publicly severed ties with German partners were revealed to have maintained financial connections through intermediary organizations that obscured the true nature of their relationships. The truth about Heinrich Müller's disappearance was far more complex than anyone had imagined. His secret Safehouse revealed that the end of World War II hadn't been the clean victory that history books described. Instead, it had been the beginning of a shadow war, where former enemies became unlikely allies, where justice was sacrificed for convenience, and where the very institutions created to prevent fascism's return had been quietly infiltrated by those who understood how to adapt and survive. Müller's decades-long operation proved that some battles don't end with surrender ceremonies or peace treaties. They simply move underground, becoming invisible networks that shape the world from hidden places. The documents found in his Bavarian complex suggested that the post-war order we thought we understood was built on foundations far more unstable and morally compromised than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Today, intelligence agencies across Europe continue analyzing the thousands of documents recovered from the Safehouse. Each revelation raises new questions about how many other Heinrich Müllers might still be out there, operating in the shadows, influencing decisions from positions we'll never know about. The investigation has forced governments to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of stability and the compromises that powerful people make when they believe the ends justify the means. Heinrich Müller had achieved something that most Nazi officials could never have imagined. He hadn't just survived the war's end. He had helped reshape the peace that followed, ensuring that certain forms of influence would persist regardless of which flags flew over government buildings or which political parties held power. His ghost had been haunting European development for 8 decades, and now that the world knew he was real, the question became whether his influence had finally died with his discovery or whether it had simply learned to hide even deeper. The construction crew that stumbled upon Müller's complex had expected to build a luxury hotel. Instead, they had excavated one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern history. A discovery that proved the past never really dies. It just waits underground, preserving its secrets until someone brave enough or foolish enough decides to start digging. And sometimes, what we find buried in the earth forces us to question everything we thought we knew about the world above it. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.